Treshani Perera is the head of Fine Arts Library Technical Services at the University of Kentucky Libraries. Treshani provides original and complex copy cataloging for all formats in the Fine Arts Library and oversees operations in cataloging, physical processing, binding, and preservation, and manages several projects. All right, take it away, Treshani.
Thank you so much, Margaret. I'm going to share my screen. Right. We're going to see my schedule first. All right. Okay. And all right. So hopefully you can see my notes.
Yes, it looks good.
Okay, great. Thank you. So hello again, everybody. Actually, let me just, okay, do that. All right. Hello again. I'm Treshani Perera. My pronouns are she, her. Thank you for that introduction, Margaret. I have a detailed bio in Sched if you'd like more information. So my presentation is titled, I flipped the titles here a little bit. If you catalog, print, and bind it, they can use it. PDF scores in circulating music library collections. I was not able to attend sessions last Friday and missed Chuck Peters' presentation on a similar topic. So apologies in advance if there's some duplication here. However, I have a feeling that I'm going to take a very different route with my presentation. So I want to begin with a few caveats. This is not a best practices type presentation. I would say that this is more of a case study approach to handling PDF scores, more specifically how my institution handles the cataloging, printing, and binding of PDF scores. This is also not a workshop for cataloging PDF scores. Hopefully you got to attend Chuck's presentation last week. I was sorry to miss it and looking forward to watching the recording to compare against our local practice for cataloging PDF scores. The purpose of my presentation is to share local workflow documents, thus the case study approach, and offer practical suggestions for cataloging, printing, and binding PDF scores. The workflow documents I have created for my institution takes into consideration our circulation policies and also the lack of technology to handle digital score access to patrons. We currently do not provide access to digital scores outside of subscription models, such as Alexander Street Press digital scores, for example. We only provide circulation access to physical scores. My goal is to provide some resources for cataloging, printing, and binding PDF scores. If you don't have the time or staffing to create a workflow or lack the technology to provide access to a digital score. The intended outcome is to provide access to local documentation used for tackling PDF scores. You can walk away with a workflow that could be customized to your institutional need if you're also looking to provide physical access to PDF scores acquired as digital files. So all of the resources I'm sharing today has a CC BY and C license, meaning you may reuse, adapt, and redistribute for non-commercial purposes. Commercial use of these resources are not allowed. Attribution to the work's works creator must be provided. Sorry about that. So if you're here for a best practices session, I will gladly point you to those resources in a few minutes. I'm going to make an assumption that many attendees are also members of the Music Library Association. A working group has been formed to tackle best practices for addressing the acquisition, cataloging, printing, binding, digital preservation, and advocacy for electronic/digital scores. Two of those areas have been addressed through best practices or guidelines documents. I'll share links to those in a bit. So as I mentioned earlier, this presentation takes more of a case study approach. I will share local cataloging decisions, some of which is reflected in OCLC records. I will provide a detailed overview of the print and bind workflow using a commercial binder, and also share guidelines for preparing PDF files for an external print and bind process. Having said that, this is not an endorsement of the vendor my institution uses. If anyone has any questions or concerns about our workflow, please do reach out to me privately. Like I said, the intended outcome is for you to get access to local documentation I have created for tackling PDF scores. I do want to include a caveat, yes, another caveat, that our local documentation may not be in alignment with best practices and expert guidelines that have come out recently. I mentioned the MLAE scores working group. So the cataloging subgroup issued a set of best practices last year. Full disclosure, just to be transparent here, I have not reviewed our documentation against those best practices yet. Based on what I learned during the MLA 2021 conference sessions that were presented by Keith Knopp and Chuck Peters, we are likely not following those recommendations closely at this time. Just sharing that for transparency, but I'm hoping we're not too off from what everybody else is doing. So I would like to share with you a website I have created with access to local documentation. I will upload my slides into Sched this afternoon, so you'll have access to all of this information plus the link to the website. So a little bit of background information. I created the website last year, but almost all of the workflow documents were created in 2020 and 2021. One of my pandemic remote work projects was to come up with a local workflow for tackling PDF scores acquired by our fine arts library. And this is why I provided the caveat that our local documentation may not be in alignment with best practices and expert guidelines. At the time of creating these workflows, there were no professional guidelines, but we needed to come up with a process to tackle the resources we've acquired since 2018. What I can assure you is that the documentation on the website have been tried and tested several times over the past few years. I have used these workflow documents to catalog, print, and bind several PDF scores in 2020 for 2 print and bind orders in 2021 and 2 more orders in 2022. Haven't done anything so far for 2023. So this website contains workflow documents and some additional resources on how University of Kentucky Libraries is tackling PDF scores. I currently manage this process, from working with our music librarian, Paula Hickner, and acquisition staff to locate recent PDF score acquisitions, format the files for commercial printing, obviously cataloging is included in there too, and submit the print and bind orders to our commercial bindery vendor, which is HF Group. I also create catalog records in OCLC and modify the local bib record to match the item in hand post-bindery. As informational resources, the website includes slides and presentation notes from a cataloging department presentation I did back in 2021. The website also includes a blog post I wrote to accompany a lightning talk I give at my institution. The blog post highlights the need for a local workflow for cataloging, printing, and binding PDF scores. The post also includes bindery instructions for 11 print and bind orders I submitted in 2020. I provide an example of a score plus parts scenario that needed special consideration due to its challenging file formatting decisions. The blog post ends with observations and lessons learned during the process of establishing this workflow at my institution. So on this website, you'll see local cataloging decisions I made in our ILS, which is Ex Libris Alma. I am not involved with the acquisition process, so cannot speak to that. I will do a plug for Christy Bergland's MOUG 2022 presentation if you would like to learn more about the acquisition of PDF scores and some of the challenges related to that process. While our setup is not perfect and there are likely flaws, I think it may be helpful to others looking to create a workflow for providing access to a PDF score in print format. If you find this information useful, I would love to hear from you. There's a contact form on the website to get in touch. You can also email me. So I'm going to exit the presentation at this time and do a brief demo of the website. Hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. Okay, so here's the website. Hopefully you all can still see this. And so I'll put the site website URL in the chat in a second. So the cataloging workflow is linked here. I may provide a little bit of background. Like I said, I created this workflow back in the fall of 2020. So this was the literature that was sort of prevalent at that time. And then here is the document, so mostly highlighting sort of specific fields, mark fields. So some of these are used in the OCLC record. And so I sort of go through the publisher information that I'm highlighting in these records, sort of physical description, how I'm handling that, the MARC 300, especially subfield C data, the MARC 500 notes. And then, so I'm not going to go through, step by step because you'll have access to this document through the website. Just wanted to point out that typically I don't review cataloging once an item has gone to the bindery, because I'm cataloging using a physical item. But in this situation, I'm cataloging using the PDF file, but then I review the catalog record with the physical item in hand, just to make sure that the dimensions match for our local items. So there are some local bib changes I make once the physical item has been received. And also, for those of you who are using Ex Libris Alma, I use internal notes to leave notes for myself, notes to the student who does the bindery review process, just so that we can flag these for CAT review after the bindery process. So these are some sort of local decisions, and here are your best practices resources, as I mentioned earlier. So there was a conference presentation in 2021, and also the best practices paper that came from the cataloging subgroup of the East Course Working Group. Then over to printing and binding workflow, I will say I have reviewed and revised this workflow quite a few times. So I go into sort of pretty extensive detail about how to format the file for printing. The primary process here is to use a commercial binder. So the printing and the binding part is done externally. We don't do any of that locally. So I go into sort of details on how to format the file, what are some of the issues that you may come across with PDF files. And then also some file naming guidelines. Now, as of up until last year, I worked with our bindery staff person to prepare these orders using the software program that our commercial binder uses. But I think, now I have access to that software directly, so I might revise this a little bit to see if it is more efficient for me to do that process as well. So yeah, so far there is a lot of sort of collaborating with this workflow. And then the rest of it is essentially the directions that have been provided by the binder. So here are your best practices resources, the additional resources that have basically come out more recently. And so I have links to that if you want to consult expert guidelines. And then here you have my sort of informational resources. It is always nerve-wracking to put your catalog records on the internet, but they are there if anybody wants to look at them. And then I just wanted to highlight the blog post because I go into detail, sort of an overview of our process. Here, it's very much sort of a narrative format, and I provide photos and examples of some of those gnarly print and bind ones I had to catalog and also decide, what to include as far as like binding instructions. And then I just wanted to point out a little bit about either the observations and lessons learned for anybody who's sort of trying to think about this process. I think communication is really important in any kind of work environment, but I think for this particular workflow, it was even more important, especially because we created this workflow during the pandemic. So a lot of communication was happening sort of electronically with various parties, right? So communication is always important. Formatting of the PDF scores, it ended up being perhaps the most time-consuming process of all of this. I will say that I have been doing the formatting myself just because of the infrequency of these orders. and also because I am able to bring my practitioner, musician experience into this process, something that I pay attention to very closely are page turns. What are the page turns that would make sense for a performer? And so trying to think about that as part of the file formatting process. For regular scores, we send all of our scores to the binder, post cataloging. For that process, I don't really review cataloging once the physical item comes back, because I'm cataloging using a physical item. But in this process, I do review our local bib record. So I don't go back and change anything in the OCLC record, but I do review the local bib record with the item in hand, just to make sure the physical dimensions didn't drastically change. There have been some instances where it moved into the the oversized location, because the printed score ended up being quite large. And so there have been some modifications to the bib record, with the printed item in hand, print and bound item in hand. And then there's a little bit more information here about file formatting and sort of the binders process. So that is my presentation. Here is my contact information. If anybody would like to get in touch. Thank you very much. So I will stop screen share. I think we have about 5 minutes for questions. Oh, yes, thank you. Sorry about that. I will put that URL.
I have a question for you, Treshani, and I
Sure.
apologize about earlier. Our library uses HF group as well, but we use the HF group in Nebraska, I think, and not the one from Indiana.
Mm-hmm.
And you may not know the answer, but do you think those two HF groups talk to each other, so that if we said, hey, talk to the Indiana group and get some of how they do these print PDF, do you have any idea if they'd say, sure, we can do that?
So I would assume yes. Hopefully they'll be willing to work with their own different locations. I do want to give a shout out to Chuck, who was very gracious in sharing about Indiana University's process when I was trying to establish a workflow. So it was great to hear that the Indiana plant had already sort of worked with libraries around this process, and so for them, it wasn't a completely new process, because there were other music libraries using them for print and bind workflows. So I would hope, I was going to say, I worked extensively with our former customer service representative to figure out the details for our workflow. Unfortunately, fortunately, I think for her, she's moved on to a different role. So we actually had a lot of back and forth when we were trying to establish a workflow, but now it's gotten to a point where we don't need to tweak it as much. Like the workflow is pretty established. I'm also happy to provide some insight, Margaret. If you want to reach out, I'm happy to share more about our process, if that's helpful to reach out to your customer service representative.
Thank you. I may be in touch on that one, because I know I've got a stack of PDF scores that I need to deal with. So
sure. Yeah. Do you want me to address these questions in the chat?
Yes, if you're comfortable with that, please go ahead.
Sure. So how do you legally print PDFs? That's a great question. I would recommend also, if you're interested about the legalities and also the licensing part of it, to look at Christie's presentation. I think she did a great job of addressing all those issues that at last year's MOUG conference. For us, it's just I'm assuming and again, I'm not a copyright expert, but I'm assuming fair use principle comes into play here for us to provide access. So we have not. So I will also say the the composers we've worked with have not provided any restrictions about like that these are not available for print use. So we've sort of used that as, you know, as a permission to provide access to a printed score. But I think some of these issues will also be tackled by that working group. So stay tuned if you're interested in learning more about that. Mark's question, is there patron demand at UK for e-access to these scores? Will something need to change in time? You know, interestingly, I think what we have found in our fine arts library is there is still quite a demand for print publications. We had even second copies, third copies for popular editions because we have had a very sort of reliable, stable demand for print scores. My colleague Paula Hickner would be a much better resource in terms of sort of statistics, but I think we have some electronic resources now, but I think what we've also found is that, you know, that hasn't sort of reduced the access to print. So we're going to continue to provide access to print because that seems to be popular among our users. How does your workflow apply to PDF scores that includes digital audio files? Oh, that's a great question. So I have not come across any PDF scores that do have a digital file, but I will just share what I do. This is sort of off topic, but what I do for, you know, regular print scores that come with an audio file. We usually just, you know, put, because the way our 856 links work, it's just a little cumbersome. People can't actually get to the audio files, surprisingly. It's just an ALMA thing. I think at our the way our ALMA is configured. So if I come across a print, you know, a score with an audio file access, I usually put that URL in a 500 note in our local catalog. So that, because for some reason our local notes, the 500 notes, are much more reliable than the URLs in 856. So that's how we tackle that. But I have not come across PDF scores with a digital audio file sort of component. So we've only been dealing with a PDF file at this point. Oh, there was another question. How do you save the electronic files of PDF music scores? So this is something that we have talked, you know, some, not as much about digital preservation of the files. At my institution, what we're doing right now is acquisitions department saves the sort of main file in our dark archive. So they take care of that process. And then they send me and the music librarian a file that we use for cataloging, printing, like reformatting. So I am not working with sort of the master file or the main file that goes into a dark archive. And so what I work with is the file that I get from acquisition. So at that point, it is an access file. Oh, thank you so much, Alyssa, for sharing that resource. Oh, yeah, Matt, go ahead.
Hi, Treshani.
Hey.
Have you guys, I see that in your blog post that you all started to print in-house, but that quickly was abandoned. I mean, have you guys tried booklet printing in-house? Are you plan on going in-house again? Is it expensive to have HF do it?
So as far as cost, it actually is not much of a difference. What we found out was, you know, in terms of the print and bind cost, just giving like somebody's work time, because, you know, booklet printing, we have just a staff printer that is not really great for archival quality printing. And so we use in-house printing only for like rush cataloging, or, you know, if it's an extreme example where we can't wait for like, you know, 2 months for the score to come back to us. But more recently, I think since the pandemic, that process has improved. I think during the pandemic, it was taking up to 2 months for these orders. But now we've been able to get a quick turnaround. It comes back in our regular process. So right now we are not doing any in-house printing because for us, sort of the justification was like, we're still going to have to spend time trying to figure this out in-house. So cost-wise, it hasn't been a big difference for us to send the file and get them to print it and bind it. Yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Sure.
Treshani, thank you so much for your presentation. And I would encourage everyone to give a virtual applause to Treshani here so that she knows how much we appreciated what she shared with us. And do keep an eye out on Sketch for Treshani is going to be sending her presentation to me and I'll get it posted. I've been having trouble with the presenters being able to put their stuff up on Sketch, but please send it to me and I will get it posted there.